Hello, everybody. My name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we'll be diving back into the Gospel Coalition and touching on an article that talks about a very relevant topic. I do not actually think this is the worst article that's been written on the Gospel Coalition. There are far worse articles that we've covered, but this is an article that does touch on an important question in my own life, something that actually does talk to me personally, but I don't think it really is honest about it, and I don't really think it's complete about the issue that it talks about. And the issue that it's talking about is relocation and balkanizing. These are two political strategies that have been touted on the conservative, anywhere right of center, actually. The idea of exiting California, exiting New York, and I live in Maryland, and Maryland is one of the states that people are exiting the most in droves. And a lot of the relocation states are, Texas and Florida are your stereotypical two. Tennessee is definitely top three, I think. And a few other states are scattered. A lot of Marylanders, I believe, like South Carolina or North Carolina. They like the Carolinas. So let's dive on into relocation. And this article is titled, Should Christians Relocate to Conservative Areas? And it's by Will Anderson, who lives in California. So that's his perspective. And as someone who lives in Maryland, which is like the California of the East Coast in some ways, but more DC influenced, again, I have a perspective that can weigh in on this without, living in the red state already. So it first talks about this real estate company that helps people relocate, and it talks about how it mentions the state Texas, Florida, and the Dakotas, Wyoming. I actually really like Wyoming. Wyoming is one of my top relocation states, and actually my top states would be Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, Florida, and Missouri. I think that's my top five. Iowa and Texas are also on the list. So I think that's like my top five or six or seven. I don't actually know how many states I counted. Wait, who's saying Ohio? The fastest growing states were Texas or Tennessee, Texas, Florida, Ohio, and Arizona, while California lost 98,000 people and forfeited a congressional seat. Now this hurts the left actually in the congressional races because Florida gained a seat, Texas gained a seat, or they gained two seats. Either way, I don't think the conservative governors gained as many seats as they were hoping for, but they gained seats as was projected. So basically, this article wants to weigh in on whether this strategy is biblical or not, and let's just get the trite stuff out of the way. And trite meaning like you probably already know this as a believer that God should dictate where you live and following Christ and where you live, where you go to church, what your income is, what your job is, uh, whether to have kids, when to have kids, if to get married, who to marry. All these things you should be trusting in God in as a believer. I don't think you need a whole article to tell you that. However, this article does raise good questions, but I don't think it provides good answers to these good questions, in my opinion. Uh, so let's dive right back in. Uh, and again, don't forget to like and subscribe to the video and channel, and also check out evangelicaldarkweb.org. I got to remember to plug those things. Utopians or exiles. So that's basically the dichotomy that this article is trying to paint. Are you trying to create a heaven on earth, or are you living according to God's word? And I think it's drawing a false dichotomy here. The first consideration is how comfortable and at home should Christians be in this world? Scripture says we're exiles in society, not homebodies. Jesus declared his sheep are misfits on this earth. Discipleship with Christ means dissonance with the world. We're countercultural, not conformists. But it's hard to take our God given misfit status seriously when countless Christians are hitting eject on their lives in challenging areas. Many Instagram posts that gush about lower taxes, and just like me, neighbors implicitly say to those left behind, don't stick it out, get out. Even for allegedly moral reasons, escapism ignores God's call to scatter to the ends of the earth in order to love the lost and lose our lives. How tragic that in order to stay faithfully planted in difficult areas, weary saints have to tune out not just the world's appeal, but also the songs of God's people. Now let's dive into that, because this is this ignores certain biblical passages. Let's talk about when Jesus commands his disciples to kick the dust off their sandals and move on to the next town if they're not properly received. That is indication that we should relocate at times. If you are in an area where you are just being inundated and you are having no success, kick the dust off your sandals and move on. I don't see what's wrong with that. I don't see why you should live in an area where you're constantly getting outvoted and you can't actually have a say in the political sphere, which also is indicative that you have no real presence in the spiritual sphere, and this community really rejects Christ. I don't have a problem with you saying, okay, let me relocate somewhere else. Moreover, let's talk about the relocation options. If I wanted to go back up to my relocation mistresses, which were Montana, Wyoming, Alaska, were 3 of them. All 3 of those areas are largely unchurched from what I gathered. These are largely unchurched areas that effective Christian reinforcement could really help out these areas. Because these populations aren't completely given over to reject Christ, as much as, like, say, New York City is. So let's just talk about that for a second. Obviously, other states like Texas and Florida have a lot of churches. Tennessee as well, a lot of churches in those states. Doesn't mean they're all good churches, but a lot of these other areas that I just mentioned, largely pretty unchurched areas. So I don't see that as... So he's trying to say that you're moving to an area that already has Christ and you can preach to the choir. That's not necessarily true. Republicans need Jesus too, and conservatives need Jesus too. This is a mission field that you're actually reaching, and you have a more effective voice, in my opinion. So he's trying to paint the people who are fleeing communist states to free states as those who are seeking utopian to free to already Christian areas, and that's just a false dichotomy. That's pretty dishonest in my opinion. It doesn't reflect data that a lot of church missions could tell you. But I guess the problem with our church missions in the United States is we have so much emphasis on cities. So when you talk about states like Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, that aren't reliant on cities. South Dakota is not really, Bismarck really, not really reliant. Bismarck's North Dakota, I think. My bad. Sioux Falls, Sioux Falls is South Carolina or South Dakota. So, all these, these aren't major cities. So let's be real. These aren't the most churched areas in the country. Now in the South, that's not exactly the same, but you get my point. Some of those states are not as churched as you would think just because they're very Republican. Christian exiles don't glorify suffering as a badge of honor, but they do expect it par for the course. Babylon has a pervasive agenda bent on blaspheming Christ's name. Environment does not affect our kids. Sometimes freedoms are environment does affect our kids. Sometimes freedoms are unjustly squelched. Is that a hyperlink? I'd like to see what they actually hyperlink to. Millions in royalties. What is that nonsense that they link to? That's a ridiculous article. They could have pointed to anything on COVID. To think of the teacher mandated by the state to push harmful sexual ethics on kids or families crushed by the high cost of living and taxes, even though they live frugally. Is there a time to move on? Certainly. Now, just to touch up on that, I believe last time I checked, if you look at the income brackets for the states in the United States, California has like the five highest income tax brackets in the United States on a state level. They have the 5 highest brackets, which is insane. It's insane to live there. And to think the high cost of living paired with the fact that you have to pay even more in taxes just means you're not accumulating more wealth. Think about that. But let's be cautiously aware that Americans vehemently avoid awkwardness, pain, and discomfort. Escape pods offer a quick relief, but simply because multitudes of our people with our values are hopping on board doesn't mean it's spiritually beneficial. Those who are tempted to overlook biases and shortcomings of their new home, since they want to believe that things are so much better than they were where they were coming from. New zip codes don't guarantee clean hearts. Even greener pastures have brown spots. I don't disagree with that last part, but again, it's trying to paint the fact that we aren't living in awkwardness and suffering. Again, has this guy been Rip Van Winkle over the last 20 months or however long it's been? Is this guy Rip Van Winkle? Like, seriously, wake up. We are living in an area, like, majority of the states in this country impose mask mandates. Majority of the states in this country impose lockdowns. This is not a quick eject. So this is a lie. This is dishonest. People have endured a long train of sufferings and abuses inflicted to them by the government. It's not a quick and easy eject to move out of a state. Now, again, I live in Maryland, so I get this. I'm not gonna pull the eject just yet, but my time, I think, is coming. And I'll talk more about that towards the end of the article. Underneath the decisions we make are the questions we ask. It's easy to assume a question is valid because everyone is asking it, including other believers, but a cursory glance at the reigning repertoire reveals our need for better questions, stated in parentheses. Why should I stay somewhere that disrespects my beliefs? Better, what might God want to accomplish in and through me by staying or moving? I think I covered this in the beginning when I talked about whether your zip code should be defined by God and that you should be following God in where you live, where you work, who you marry, when you have kids. All that stuff should be you following God. How can I make life easier or safer? Christians aren't called to live easy and safe lives. Better, how can I show the courage of a disciple of Christ and his sovereignty over circumstances? Again, that's very trite when applying this to this question because it's not very indicative of the answer to the question at hand, should you stay or should you go? So I don't think that's a very helpful question. This is a good question. Why would I let my kids grow up here? And the better question, I think that first question is actually really good. What intentional adjustments can I make in the way I disciple my kids? What other Christian parents will link arms with me in this effort? And that's kind of a bad question. The first question had it right. When you think about the where you live and the influence that can have on your kids, you need to think about that. You need to be on guard as a parent. Everyone wants to think that their public school districts aren't as bad as they are. They want to think that their politicians aren't as bad as they are. That whole, it's the other districts problem. And you see that a ton on Republicans because Democrats are a hive mind. But Republicans, it's like you have some good ones, you got some bad ones, you got a lot of mediocre ones. And, no one thinks that the people in South Carolina don't think that Lindsey Graham's a problem, and then everywhere else in the country knows that Lindsey Graham's a problem. Stuff like that. Why should I let my kids grow up here? And you think about states like Maryland, or even a city like Baltimore. Why would you want your kids to grow up there? Answer that question. Why would you want your kids to grow up in San Francisco? Why would you want your kids to grow up in Loudoun County, Virginia, where they're getting butt raped in schools? Why would you want your kids to grow up there? And the school board doesn't really care, and the school systems said, "No, we're going to shove this under the rug." And just a reminder that schools have a serious problem with doing this. It's not just the Catholic Church. Public schools are actually probably way worse than the Catholic Church if statistics and my recent research on this is true, which I believe it is. So, as for what other Christian parents will link arms with me, we're seeing a huge crisis in this country of parents not stepping up, especially when it comes to masking kids in schools. They're not stepping up on that issue. What makes you think they'll step up with you on a different issue? So I don't see, I see a lot of people are alone, and even in the church, many still feel like they're alone. They were waiting for other Christians to link arms with them, and that didn't happen. It did not happen. So I don't see this as a quick and easy eject. Like I said before, Christians are not just giving up. Right? It's 2021. If you're relocating to a different state, it's not because you're choosing the easy way out. The easy way out, or you could be accused of taking the easy road, the first train out 10 years ago. But that's not the case anymore. Actually, maybe even 20 years ago, because the whole notion of red state, blue state, every state or most states were swing states until the year 2000. So this isn't really, we suffered a long train of abuses. Where will state policy reflect my theology? Better question. With the gifts God has given me, how can I reflect Him in this tough environment with truth and grace? No, the first question again was actually a better question, because politics affects culture, and that culture does affect policy or theology. It just does. It's called syncretism, or syncretism. Sorry. The idea that your environment or a different religion or worldview influences the church. Think about how many of these cities, or actually Tim Keller is a perfect example of this. Let me go to New York, and then he sounds like a New Yorker. And New York City, very pagan environment, and it bleeds on Tim Keller. And that's why Tim Keller is so trash. So just think about that. Think about Minneapolis, where John Piper is very inept on dealing with any cultural issues. Why? Because he lives in Minneapolis. Again, Minnesota is a very weird state politically, actually. And that bleeds into John Piper's politics. And then you look at a lot of these Southerners who aren't very skilled at understanding politics. It's because these states aren't as conservative as you think. Like, if I wanted to rank the most conservative states in the country, Alabama would obviously be one of them. Mississippi, I think, would be another. But then you're going to states like Idaho, and Idaho would then be the state you would move to. So it wouldn't be a lot of these states in the South. Like, a lot of these states in the South aren't very conservative. Now, states like Missouri and Arkansas are getting more conservative, but like a state like Tennessee isn't that conservative. A state like South Carolina nominates Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott to the Senate. These aren't very conservative states. Let's be real about this. Georgia, not very conservative, despite its reputation. Like, let's be real. These states aren't that conservative. They're just very Republican. So, and because of that, you see a lot of these squish pastors come out of these states. Texas is very on a spectrum. So you got the Robert Jeffress crowd. And again, I think a lot of that Texasness is in him. So let's just be real. The state that you're in does bleed into your theology if you allow it. And I think one of the biggest problems in Christianity in America is we've allowed the culture around us to influence the politics of the church. And, that's been going on for a long time in this country. Certainly the North-South divide, it bled in there. And, afterwards, certainly that trend has continued, and it's probably more polarized, where blue state churches reflect more like blue states and red state churches act more like red states. And what we certainly know is that city churches are way more woke than rural churches. But again, the rural churches are being infested with critical race theory all the same. So I don't think that's a wrong question. I think that question is very a question every church should be evaluating, is how local politics and state policy influences their congregation. Every church should ask themselves that question. Where will I feel at home politically and culturally? Better question, how will moving away affect my lost friends, family, and neighbors? Here, am I trying to create a pseudo heaven, or do I trust God's promise of heaven enough to make sacrifices now? Again, this goes back to the fact that you're kicking the dust off your sandals and saying this state sucks, I'm moving somewhere else. California sucks, I'm moving east. Maryland sucks, I'm moving south. New York sucks, I'm moving south. Illinois sucks, I'm going to Missouri or hopping that line. Iowa, something like that. Like, these aren't... Again, I think this is a kind of a weak... This is some weak sauce right here. The idea of, oh, it's going to affect my lost friends and my neighbors. People move all the time, and, you know, your next door neighbor isn't going to care that much, generically speaking. Now, family, that's a bigger issue. That's a bigger issue to move away from family. A lot of people do that. A lot of people can't make that move, though. And I get that. I understand that. That'd be the hardest thing about moving from Maryland, is that part right there. So I get that question. That's something you should think of, but that's not... the effect on your family isn't exactly a question no one has thought of. Good questions help us to answer the why behind our wanderlust. For one person, obedience might mean staying put. For another, it could be moving away. And I think the point of this article is to convince you that it's not moving away. I think that's the purpose of this article. It's trying to say that you aren't actually called to move anywhere, and you should stay and embrace the suck. That's basically what the purpose of this article is. Serious believers will not pack their bags because it's trendy in their tribe. Instead, they'll ask uncomfortable questions that screen their motives. Again, it's not just trendy, it's also strategic. It's strategic to abandon blue states so that they lose congressional seats to move the red states, give them and their conservative governors states or seats to redraw. And, you know, you can take back the federal government, you can take back Congress incrementally in that way, but you can also balkanize these areas to create strongholds against government influence on your life, on your theology, on your praxis, on your church. I don't think this is as trendy as he makes it seem. This is actually strategic, and that's the thing that he's ignoring. We need examples of Christians who faithfully stay and go. The stories that captivate us are stories we end up living. So here are a few. I don't feel like reading those stories. And also read the powerful Gospel Coalition article about Christians serving Minneapolis amid the rioting and violence sparked by George Floyd's murder. Oh, wow. I bet that was pretty woke. But I digress. I don't have time for that. God sees every act of faithfulness, rewards obedience, and guarantees justice. Do we actually trust God to deliver those promises, or do we scan Zillow looking for our promised land? An address is more than some numbers and letters or a pin on a map. Sometimes it's a statement about who we believe God is. I think that last part is true. I really do. Like, I don't think this is the worst Gospel Coalition article I've ever read. It's certainly far from the worst I've ever read this year or even in the last month or two. But the problem is it's incomplete, and I think at times it's a little dishonest. These are it's not, because this guy's probably not a conservative politically, so he doesn't understand the conservatives who are moving because of basically political persecution in California, where, you know, they can't win. They'll just get out ballot harvested. You can print out your ballots, and then you can also harvest ballots politically. That's completely legal in California. You can't win there politically. And they're enacting measures to punish you politically. And then they tax you heavily. So I don't see the need to stay in California. It sucks there. You know, I do agree that some people are missionally called. Now, I do want to talk to people who are in enclaves that are actually red in states that are heavily blue. I live in one of these enclaves. And the thing is, you need to before you kick the dust off your sandals, I think you need to get involved locally. You need to get involved in local politics if you're in one of these enclaves, because you don't kick the dust off your sandals if you don't even try. If you don't even try to make a difference. And yes, I do believe politics is a mission field. It is a mission field because, first of all, like I said, Republicans and Democrats both need Jesus. Politics gives you an opportunity to preach the gospel, to also perform good works for the culture at large. So you can enact good policy. And one of the things I think every local Republican enclave should be enacting is never again ordinances. So that no more lockdowns, no more mask mandates, any of that. You should be enacting never again ordinances to prevent any of that. If you can do that locally, you should stay and maybe fight. Now, and again, you're not kicking the dust off your sandals if you haven't tried yet. So that's what I want to leave off with. I want to kind of inspire hope, because now's the time to start thinking about running if you're going to do that for 2022. Now's the time to start thinking about filing if you're going to do that for 2022. And start looking at candidates for 2022, because this is actually going to be an important election on a local level, not necessarily a national level, but on a local level. This might be a very important election as across the country is what I'm trying to say. Like across the country, this is probably one of the most important elections at a local and state level in our lifetimes. So that's what I got to say about that. My name's Ray. This is the Evangelical Dark Web. If you like this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. And also check out evangelicaldarkweb.org, and you can subscribe there as well to help support this ministry, this website, keep the lights on and stuff like that. Have a blessed day. Let me know what you think about what I think, and I will catch you on the next one.